Dead Space on PC is a game that does a lot right at launch, but much like the PlayStation 5 version with its distracting variable rate shading at its launch, the PC version still has a number of issues which overshadow an otherwise high-quality remake of the 2008 game. In today's video, I will detail those issues, talk about some tricks you can use to improve performance and image quality, and provide a brief comparison to the PlayStation 5, as well as giving you and the audience optimized settings to make your playthrough a bit smoother than it otherwise might be. But before I get into all that, let us start where I always start, and that is in the game's menu. Dead Space's menu is pretty great. Calls back to the original menu of the 2008 game and does a variety of things right. Menu items show how many total options there are with little pips on the bottom. There are a variety of rarer things like dynamic resolution and variable rate shading, and the graphical options menu fades out any background graphics when you are in it, so you can see changes in real time in the background. That is really nice to see and something indeed every game should try and emulate. But still, not everything's perfect here. The menu animations themselves all run at 30 FPS, weirdly enough, and even those menu animations in the game world do, which is a bit odd. This makes the game feel a bit more sluggish in its menus than it really needs to. Another oddness is that although you can see the changes happening in real time, the performance may not be perfect after you change an option. I've seen lower than expected performance after changing options at times, and saw similar reports online, so if you are changing options, I do recommend a full game restart, so that your performance is not weirdly affected in your playthrough. Well, I will get back to that later in the video when talking about optimized settings. A really important thing that Dead Space Remake does is that it pre-compiles some shaders the first time you start the game. It takes longer than a minute on a Core i9-12900K and just under 3 minutes on a Ryzen 5 3600. This is most excellent to see given how many titles release without doing this and just leave their PC versions stuttery messes. But unfortunately, I think Dead Space Remake's shader pre-compilation is incomplete and perhaps even flawed. I think it's flawed perhaps as fresh installing the driver with the same driver number and deleting the PC shader cache manually does not re-trigger the pre-compilation sequence. I've only been able to get it to actually redo the pre-compilation sequence by installing drivers with different driver numbers. This is bad, as if someone were to reinstall the driver with the same driver number, like you're seeing here, which I did on a Ryzen 5 3600, the game will not pre-cache shaders on start, leading to huge stutters for basic actions that otherwise would not be there if the shader pre-compiler had actually worked. Given this issue and the fact that shader pre-compilation only happens once in a noticeable way, I'm not positive if changing settings also could perhaps induce shader compilation stutter. The pre-compilation step cannot be fully trusted at the moment. That brings me to the second issue, and that is I think shader pre-compilation is not fully exhaustive. I cannot prove it perfectly, but there are a number of stutters I encountered in my play which manifested a lot like shader compilation stutter. For example, in the game's intro, the first time you play it on any PC and the wormhole opens, it causes a big stutter. But the second time you would play that, it would not happen. And if you were to reinstall the driver, guess what? Stutter happens again. So it seems there's a bit of shader compilation stutter struggle in this game, in spite of the pre-compilation. But these type of stutters are rarer, and there are other more pressing issues. Let us go back to that original cutscene again, but this time on a Ryzen 5 3600 with an RTX 2060 Super. Another issue that you can see happening is that the Dead Space Remake sometimes runs certain scenes worse for completely unknown reasons. Notice how the beginning of the cutscene here between both runs has the same frame rate, but after this character walks on scene, suddenly the first playthrough of the game is running 10% slower, and it runs 10% slower consistently all the way until the ship is about to hit the Ishimura. Now there's nothing that I changed in settings between these runs. In fact, the PC was even rebooted one time between these runs on purpose to have a blank slate in RAM and virtual memory. I measured this happening on this PC as well as once on the RTX 4090. So sometimes, for reasons I can't explain, Dead Space just kind of runs the same scene worse for some reason. But that and the infrequent shader compilation stutter are minor issues in comparison to Dead Space's largest issue, which is traversal and streaming stutter. Based upon what I can see, Dead Space suffers from frequent, repeatable, and unpreventable frame time spikes when the character moves around the game world. It appears that when the player character crosses invisible boundaries in the map, different sections ahead and adjacent to the player will load behind the closed doors. This causes a stutter and a frame time spike nearly each time, and it occurs with specific patterns all over the game world. For example, watch this. The first time I enter this room on a Core i9 1200K with an RTX 4090, I will walk over to the corner, which will load an area presumably behind the closed door there, and there's a large frame time spike to 150 milliseconds or so. It's distracting. From this point, I will circle back around and go back into that same corner again. And you will see a similar frame time spike occurring at the exact same time, at the exact same location when I cross an invisible threshold. But the second time I do it, it is much smaller than the first, here spiking to 33 milliseconds. This is the basic behavior I usually see. The first time you reach an area, the frame time spike is larger. But if you stay in the same area and cross that same threshold again, the frame time spike tends to be smaller, but still very visible. On the face of it, it might not be that bad, but it really happens all over the place in the Dead Space Remake, and it most definitely heavily intrudes on the gameplay experience when just walking around. It robs the game of its otherwise impeccable atmosphere in those moments when a stutter occurs. And it happens frequently, like I'm saying. Sometimes it happens every few meters depending upon how many doors are in the area. I find it confusing though that the game loading causes any stutter at all actually, as you cannot actually see the areas being loaded in. They're behind doors. And these doors have very slow animations to open. So why are these areas that cannot be seen that are loading with such intensity that they impact the playable smoothness on the critical path frame time? Why aren't they loading more slowly and bit by bit without an impact on frame time? I'm not sure why, but one thing is for certain, the intensity and frequency of these spikes in frame time increase the less powerful your PC is. When I was playing the game at my optimized settings on a Ryzen 5 3600 with an RTX 2060 Super, it honestly did feel and look pretty awful at times just wandering around with those constant dips and stutters. In that one room that I showed off earlier on the 4090 and 1200K, the behavior was even worse on this mid-range PC. Instead of 33.3 millisecond frame time spikes every time I would return to that corner, I saw frame time spikes that could be in excess of 100 milliseconds or so every time I would go to that corner. The issue I have with these stutters is that there's nothing you can do about them as a player on any platform actually to alleviate them. But the way it currently works, I imagine it will only be able to be cleaned up by a hypothetically much faster PC CPU from the future that just doesn't exist. The PC version here, though, is interestingly not alone, as the consoles suffer from this issue, but with less intensity, and it can manifest there sometimes differently. As Oliver mentions in his video, when covering the console performance, you see these same spikes on console there, but it doesn't always manifest as a frame time spike measurable by frame rate tools, but it will instead manifest as a pause in the game animation and world update. For example, I measured it happening each time in this area on the PlayStation 5 for 1 or 2 frames, where the animation would always stop, much like a frame time spike. I also measured that exact same behavior occurring sometimes on PC, like here on the Core i9 12900K. In this scene here, running around does not cause a real frame time spike or a frame rate drop, but the visual output definitely looks like a hitch is occurring. And when I go back over the footage, it's indeed possible to see how the game animation will pause for 1 or 2 frames, just like it does on the console versions. So yes, I've been able to reproduce the stuttering in my testing, and I hope the developers look to fix it in any way possible. Currently, I think on mid-range PCs, like the Ryzen 5 3600 I talked about earlier, that the amount of stuttering seriously impacts the gameplay experience and the atmosphere that Dead Space ought to have. Okay, so now let's talk about optimized settings and a bit how PS5 compares to PC. First, by going over those image quality options. You have access to DLSS 2.5.0 in this game and FSR 2.1.2, and in general, this is a game where DLSS tends to work better with the game's general artwork. Differences that are notable are those found on particles, where FSR2 here produces noticeable ghosting in all types of particles, often looking like an eye burn-in is occurring, as I saw one person describe it on Twitter. Basically, trails behind particles that stick around for a number of frames afterward. This doesn't happen on DLSS. Another noticeable difference is how image reconstruction interacts with the user interface. Animated UI in the game does not appear to be correctly accounted for with this game's FSR2 implementation on console or PC, so it tends to look ghosty and aliased in those areas where DLSS or native with TAA do not. The last primary noticeable difference in image quality is that DLSS can tend to just offer a more stable anti-aliasing resolve actually than native with TAA or FSR2, but this will indeed be rather minor in the grand scheme of things. Both DLSS and FSR FSR in this game will show worse textures than those found in the native plus TAA. When we zoom in here and look at this texture and decals on this environmental detail here, we can see how the texture is notably higher resolution in the 4K native plus TAA version of this scene versus DLSS or FSR. This is not because DLSS or FSR are reconstructing in a blurry way, but it's because the wrong texture MIP is used. Typically, a game using DLSS or FSR2 should bias the texture MIP to be the same as the output resolution, and I don't think Dead Space is doing this. There's no way to fix this on AMD or Intel hardware to my knowledge, but on Nvidia GPUs, you can use Nvidia Profile Inspector, open up the profile for Dead Space Remake, scroll down to Anti-Aliasing Transparency Super Sampling and set it to AA mode, Replay mode all, and then scroll down to Texture Filtering and adjust the LOD BIOS for DirectX accordingly. Here I recommend -1.5 for performance mode, -1.0 for balance mode, and -0.5 for quality mode. When this is done and the profile has been applied, you can go in game and see that textures will now look noticeably higher resolution at a distance than they otherwise would have looked with the default texture bias as applied by the game. That is nice, but there is a knock-on negative effect where texture bias applies to all textures, including those in the menu that are used to distort and pixelize the image there, which makes the menus in the game flicker more and show moire patterns where they otherwise would not have them. So there's a little price to pay for this not being natively done by the game itself in a selective manner. So keep that in mind if you want to use this tweak. The other image quality options here on PC, like variable rate shading and dynamic resolution scaling, are pretty rare to see actually, and this is where my first optimized settings recommendations come in. Looking at variable rate shading, I do not recommend using it for most players. Based upon my measurements at typical gameplay scenarios where a user will be using image reconstruction at 1440p or 4K, I actually measure a degradation of performance when turning on variable rate shading. I imagine this happens due to the fact that variable rate shading has a setup cost, and the developers are being smartly conservative with how much it actually degrades the image quality. This only reverses at higher resolution like native 4K, where I was able to measure an appreciable 6% uplift in performance on an RTX 2060 Super. On an RTX 4090 though, I was only able to see around a 1% performance uplift at a native 4K max settings over an extended period of performance comparison. So the utility here is rather low and situational, and I only recommend it if you're playing this game at internal resolutions of around 4K or even higher. Most of you otherwise just turn off this feature. Dynamic resolution is similarly limited, but still recommendable. When turned on, it will dynamically reduce resolution by around 17% of the total internal resolution in my testing, and improve performance up to your chosen refresh rate ratio. Like here, we can see it on an RTX 2060 Super in 1440p DLSS quality mode. The internal resolution went from 960p to around 875p here, and it helps the performance a bit when set to on. It is still below 60 FPS here in the scene because there's an internal cap on how low the internal resolution can go. There's also a secondary minimum resolution that the game can run at with DRS on. For example, here, in that same scene, we can see that dynamic res doesn't help performance at all, as apparently the minimum resolution for dynamic res is half the output axis resolution. So you won't see any benefits if you're playing the game with performance mode image reconstruction. I still recommend turning it on though, as it has its utility, of course, and it doesn't disrupt image quality at all when combined with things like DLSS or FSR. Beyond image quality options like dynamic resolution or image reconstruction, I find Dead Space's other options for graphics rather limited, and this influences their effectiveness in optimized settings and confounds our ability to match the settings on the PlayStation 5 version. Let me show you what I mean with the option for lighting quality. In my testing, the medium, high, and ultra settings for this option run and look the same. I've only found that the low option affects the image, and that gets rid of a lot of the game's dynamic lights, but it also consequently ups the performance by around 20% or so. As you can imagine, since 3 of the options look and perform the exact same, and only low looks radically different, I don't really know what setting the PlayStation 5 is running at other than it's not low. Here I recommend medium to ultra for anyone. Reflection quality is similar on PC, where ultra to high runs and looks the same in my testing, and only going down to medium changes things by turning off SSR completely. That has a minor performance uplift. This is not all the option does though, as it also controls the quality of real-time cube maps the game has. When set to low, the resolution of those real-time cube maps is dramatically lowered with a minor performance uptick. Given how this option is set up and the performance it entails, I don't recommend changing it from high or ultra. PS5 here obviously has SSR, so it's something like high or ultra, but investigating its cube map resolution I found it kind of looked different than what I saw on PC, so perhaps it has its own custom setting. Here I think the developers missed a big opportunity with this setting to increase the game's graphical quality, as I find the screen space reflections in Dead Space Remake to be very grainy and chunky, especially if you use image reconstruction like FSR or DLSS. Ultra, in my opinion, really should have upped the SSR quality significantly. As it is right now, both high and ultra look the same, and the game's SSR doesn't look too hot always. The shadow option is one of the minor performance wins you can get for optimized settings. Turning this down decreases the quality of screen space shadows, where they are less complete and fuzzier the lower it goes down to medium, and then going down to low beyond that turns screen space shadows off completely. Here the PS5 screen space shadows line up perfectly with the amount of samples and noise as found on PC's medium setting. Here there's a minor bump in performance on hardware like an RTX 2060 Super when going down to medium, and I recommend that for my optimized settings. Volumetric quality is another odd one where ultra or high look the exact same, but going down to medium has a small 4% performance increase for very little visual difference, and going down to low improves performance by 6% over higher ultra, while just making the volumetric fog look a little bit hazier. Given how the volumetric lighting is cleaned up temporally in this game, I find it almost impossible to discern what the PlayStation 5 is using between medium, high, or ultra. I would say it's not using low though, due to the fact that low, like here, can sometimes have a little pulsating firefly visible next to the light source. That doesn't happen on medium or above. Here I recommend medium for optimized settings. The last meaningful setting for optimized settings is ambient occlusion. Here ray traced ambient occlusion decreases the amount of light leaking found in the game, like under this bench here, where it is more realistically darkened with RTAO on. The performance cost is typically around 10% on an RTX 2060 Super, and that is actually very cheap in my opinion for a ray tracing effect that has a meaningful effect on the game's presentation. The amount of VRAM utilization added from turning on RTAO is also low given what's going on, just around 250 megabytes in my measurement. The effect on CPU performance is also rather minimal in my measurements. Just a handful of percentage performance reduction there. But still, I recommend turning this off for GPUs like the RTX 2060 Super level, as turning on RTAO will hamper the ability for such GPUs to consistently hit 60 FPS, with having the game have reasonable image quality. Rather, I recommend RTAO for GPUs of the 2080 class or higher basically, when trying to get 60 FPS. The last in-game setting is depth of field, and it is incredibly minor as there's very little gameplay that actually ever has depth of field in it in Dead Space Remake. The game also has very few directed cutscenes with depth of field on. As you can see, when it is there on screen very briefly, the high and low setting is just a binary on and off toggle. High has depth of field and low does not have depth of field. PS5 obviously has depth of field on, so it is using the high setting here. Here I don't have a recommendation as this effect is used so sparingly and it is not used in gameplay. All in all, my optimized settings look like this. A few nips and tucks in some areas that are practically invisible, where most of the real performance wins in this game will be found utilizing image reconstruction and dynamic resolution. With that being said, I need to talk about how this game can have very unstable performance on certain PCs due to how it utilizes video memory. Basically, the game can sometimes all of a sudden drastically pump more data into the video memory, usually in cutscenes, which then triggers a cascade effect where the game runs incredibly slow, as it would appear that the game has run out of video memory. I did not replicate this issue happening on 8GB GPUs at all in my play at 1440p with my optimized settings, but I did replicate it on a 10GB GPU, an RTX 3080 at 4K output at optimized settings. Let's examine what happens when it occurs to get an idea of what's going on. Here I'm playing on the RTX 3080 and I walk into the ship and listen to the other crewmate. GPU utilization and CPU utilization are nice and healthy values. 60 FPS is being maintained with optimized settings at 4K with DLSS balance mode and dynamic resolution being set to on. Video memory utilization is around 7.4 gigabytes. As I start the cutscene by triggering it, immediately 2 gigabytes of data are flushed into GPU memory, which apparently causes a really large frame drop as the cutscene starts. But the 3080's performance normalizes a bit due to dynamic resolution kicking in, and the cutscene slowly starts to end, and the amount of VRAM being used goes down by about 1 gigabyte as performance also plateaus again at 60 FPS. So it's sitting still and performance is fine and VRAM utilization is below a killer threshold. But the second part of the cutscene starts and VRAM utilization once again pumps up rapidly, going up to 9.2 gigabytes being allocated and presumably more spilling over the total VRAM that the 3080 has access to. As the cutscene starts, there's a huge stutter and performance tanks incredibly, with the frame rate being around 10 FPS as each frame takes around 100 milliseconds to render. This extremely low frame rate continues on throughout the cutscene and even a great deal after the cutscene ends, until we can see the VRAM being utilized go down and change, and then the 3080 starts to run as normal again, going up to 60 FPS almost immediately. This shows two things to me. One is that the 3080 at 4K can have VRAM issues due to its 10 gigabytes of VRAM. It also shows that cutscenes in this game rapidly flush GPU memory with data, which appears to cause frame drops, and potentially disastrous frame drops, if VRAM is spilling over like I think it is happening here. If you are seeing this behavior on your GPU, then I recommend turning off ray tracing perhaps at the resolution you are at to reduce the amount of pressure on video memory, but it also may not happen to you at all. I played this scene over 4 times and it happened twice. With the second time it happening, it did not run nearly as poorly as it did the first time when it happened. So your mileage may actually vary here. The last thing to mention regarding Dead Space performance is the effect of resizable bar being forced for Nvidia users. For those who do not know, resizable bar is a fancy name for the CPU being able to access the entire frame buffer over PCI Express. This is supported on AMD's recent GPUs, Intel hardware, and on RTX 3000 and above on the Nvidia side. The Nvidia driver has a whitelist for which games have resizable bar enabled for them. Nvidia curates this list and Dead Space is not on it, so the game does not start supporting resizable bar. I've read online that people get massive increases in performance by turning this on, so I tested it out. To turn it on, go to Nvidia Profile Inspector, load up the Dead Space Remake profile, scroll down to ReBAR feature, enable it, and then change the options and size limits to the profiles used for Battlefield 5 and the rest of those titles listed. After I applied, I was only able to measure about a 1% total performance increase on an RTX 3080 when CPU limited on a Ryzen 5 3600 while running across the game world. So I didn't measure it helping too much. But hey, look at those traversal stutters there. They're happening just every few meters really and looking pretty bad. I saw a very similar effect on the RTX 4090 when CPU limited on the Core i9 12900K. Just a 4% increase in performance there with ReBAR forced on. So I think it helps, but over a course of play with a variety of views, it has less of an effect on total performance than what you may read online in my testing. And that's it for the Dead Space Remake on PC. I like the game, but I think the PC version could definitely use some work in specific areas. The biggest issue is traversal stutter. Just moving around the game world, like we see here, induces large frame time spikes, just every few meters as the game world beyond closed doors appear to stream and load in. The stuttering is very intrusive to gameplay and atmosphere on PC, where it definitely manifests more intensely than it does on the consoles, which also suffer from the same issue actually. The game may have a bit of stutter from shader compilation as well, based upon that opening cutscene that I showed off earlier, but the traversal stutter is the game's primary issue. Another thing I would like to see changed would be the menu graphical options, as they're not too helpful at the moment, with a number of presets between medium and ultra not appearing to change visuals or performance at all. A good example is with the reflection setting. Realistically, this should be 2 separate options, with one controlling QMAP reflection quality and the other controlling SSR quality. Then there should be more meaningful differences between ultra and low respectively. But that's about it and enough from me for now. If you did enjoy this video, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. If you're already a subscriber, hit that little bell in the corner to be informed as soon as Digital Foundry posts a video. If you want to help out, support DF on Patreon to get years of our content in high quality for download and to help enable in-depth PC videos like this one. Other than that, comment below, follow on Twitter, and as always, this is Alex bidding you farewell und auf Wiedersehen.